So good afternoon, everyone. Now that we finally got all the technology sorted out, so welcome to Kendra Gillis's BUL seminar. So today, Kendra will be talking to us about some laboratory experimental work that she did in the Pi Chamber at Michigan Tech, which she'll talk to us about. So Kendra came to us from a bachelor's degree in physics at BYU, Idaho. And kind of decided to switch gears and come here and study meteorology at OU. Kendra, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you everybody for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about the research we did on subgrid-scale modeling of the scalar variance in large eddy simulation. So this is a study of turbulent flow, and so it would be reasonable to start with a scientific definition of turbulent flow if we had one. But kind of the running definition is, well, it's not laminar flow anymore. There's different research going into, what Reynolds number does it become turbulent? How large do the eddies have to be to become turbulent? But nothing's really been established. So generally, the more or less definition of turbulent flow is just this, you can see it here in this picture, just all of the spinning and the eddies and the chaotic motion of a fluid that's been disturbed. So this can be represented with just lots of what we call eddies, which is just where the fluid is spinning. Obviously, often it's also moving in a direction, so it might be moving, from left to right on the screen. What really makes it turbulent is all of the spinning motion that's going on. So the hope is that if we could understand these eddies and these spinning motions, then we could better understand and better model fluid turbulence. So the Reynolds number is the main number we use when we're studying turbulent flow. It's the density of the fluid multiplied by the flow speed, multiplied by the characteristic linear dimension, and divided by the dynamic viscosity of the fluid. So in our research, most of these things are going to be staying constant, but as you can see here, you could vary the temperature, and that would vary the Reynolds number, and that'll come up a little bit later. But this more or less shows just how turbulent a turbulent flow is. If the Reynolds number is very low, it's laminar or close to laminar, but if it's very, very high, then it's going to be extremely turbulent with lots of eddies, lots of different sizes. The equations we use to study turbulent flow are the Navier-Stokes equations. And pretty much just what these two equations show is that it's there are no sinks or sources in the flow, is that it's non-compressible, and also that, that the motion is the forces equals the mass times the acceleration. So these are just very basic equations changed to make sense for turbulence flow. These are well-known equations, well-documented equations. The variables equal the total equations when they're all fully written out. And so we call them closed equations. And so if we can simulate a turbulent flow with Navier-Stokes equations, we have almost 100% accuracy. That tells us exactly what the fluid is doing. So that would be the ideal situation if we could just simulate all fluid flows using the Navier-Stokes equation. But that's not possible because the eddies just get so small and everything just gets so complicated that modeling every single molecule and every single eddy with these complicated equations would be far too complicated. And so what we do instead is we kind of, if you can imagine, splitting it up and simulating the large ones with the Navier-Stokes equations, but then the smaller eddies, we just use models to represent. And that's what's called large eddy simulation. And the small eddy model is just kind of assumed to be at the end. So the simulations where you simulate all of the eddies, it's called direct numerical simulation. And it has a good accuracy. And the equations are closed because there's some same number of equations and unknowns. But it's computationally very expensive because you have to simulate every single eddy. However, with the large eddy simulations, the accuracy can be very good if the models are good, and it's computationally much easier. Unfortunately, there are more variables than equations because you have to take into account the smaller eddies that aren't part of the simulation. And so because of that, you have to be able to model some of the variables that we don't have equations for. That's generally referred to as the closure problem. So just to reiterate that, this is what a direct numerical simulation is. So if you can imagine, this is the energy by the wave number. And this is kind of the spinning of what the turbulence would look like. And everything is simulated with the Navier-Stokes equation. But if we were to filter it and to have the larger eddies simulated, but the smaller eddies modeled, this partial tau over partial x on the far right is added to the equation, and now we have more equations, or sorry, now we have more variables than we do equations. And just to help you visualize it, this is if we were modeling more eddies and simulating fewer. So this would be a computationally easier LES. And this would be a computationally more expensive LES if we were to simulate most of the eddies and just model the very, very smallest ones. So this tau at the end is the thing that we're really interested in because we understand the Navier-Stokes equations pretty well. And so if we could get a very accurate model for tau, we could do very accurate large eddy simulations, which would be computationally significantly less expensive for high Reynolds situations. And we do this through what's called a priori and a posteriori testing. And the idea is that you have a controlled environment, generally a wind tunnel or some sort of chamber, and you have a controlled turbulence going on in the environment, and that way you know most of the variables that will be going into your model. And then in that controlled environment, you calculate a subgrid-scaled model from either DNS or a direct experimental data. So you either run a DNS on a large computer or you run the experimental data, and then you build the model, you build tau from that, and that's an a priori test. And then the a posteriori test is when you put that model, that partial tau that we saw earlier on the slide, into an LES, and then you run the LES and you compare it to the data that is gathered, generally from the same wind tunnel or the same chamber. You still want it in a controlled environment because you want to be able to test how well it runs within an LES. So for our testing, we were doing a priori testing. So we were just gathering data and building tau to be put into an LES later. So this is the testing we were doing, is we were interested in the turbulence of saturation. Although potential LES subgrid models have been researched for many types of turbulence, it generally is done in dry air. Humidity just adds another complication that most people don't want to have to worry about. And so because of that, little LES research has been done on saturated or supersaturated air. Turbulence in supersaturated air is necessary, however, to understand and better model cloud formation, precipitation, and storm formation. Obviously, a lot of weather that goes on in the atmosphere. The air isn't 100% dry, and so if we could better understand and better model saturation, we could better model what's actually going on. Turbulent fluctuations of supersaturation are difficult to measure though, but are very closely correlated with turbulent temperature fluctuations. And so because of this, we built a thermistor array and used it to measure turbulent temperature fluctuations within a controlled environment. So this way we could better understand the supersaturation fluctuations, and that would help us better model clouds and storms, mostly cloud formation. So these are the basic way trimmed down equations for supersaturation variance. And just like I showed you the tau in the Navier-Stokes equation earlier, this is that tau. And if we could better model this tau for supersaturation, we could then build a better LES for saturation turbulence. So these are the models that we're using for tau. And there's lots of references because we did not design these models. We found these models from other people. So there's the scale-similarity model and the gradient model. And so these are just two models that we'll be able to put our data into in order to build the model for the Navier-Stokes equation. And then later there'll be a posteriori testing where they'll put it into an LES and make sure that and test how well these models run. But right now we're just finishing building these models. As you can see, this theta here after the tau, that's the raw data that we gathered in. And as you can see, it's gone through several filters. So that was the first thing we had to do when we get the data in order to build the models, is to filter it. And that represents the grid spacing that we'll be having when we're collecting data. So essentially, the thermistors are very close together that we use to collect data. And through filter it, it's showing a larger grid spacing because we won't always be able to collect data with them that close together. These are the thermistors we use to collect data. This is a lined notebooks that's sitting behind them. And they're sitting on tiny cutout breadboards that they're soldered into. So they are very, very tiny, just a few centimeters tall each. This tiny, I tried to point at it with an arrow. It's hard to see in the picture. And this tiny little wire that almost looks like a fishing wire with the resistor on it is the actual instrument thermistor itself. There was a running joke while we were there that nobody should even talk about thermistors because then they'll know and they'll break. We did lose several brave thermistors on our mission up in Michigan Tech. Very, very fragile, but luckily we were able to save enough to get the data that we really needed. And this is the pi chamber that we use to run our experiments in. This is a picture of it. This is a diagram of it to understand it better. And if you can imagine, the cylinder slides into a large box, and the cylinder itself is about 1 meter tall and 2 meters in diameter. And because of that, it's roughly 1 pi meter cubed in volume, and hence the pi chamber. And then it slides into this rectangular box. And when you close it up, it's pretty close to airtight. And so you can control, as much as you can control turbulence, you can control the turbulence going on in this pi chamber. And the turbulence we used was temperature-induced turbulence. And the way we did that is we heated the bottom and cooled the top. And just because the warm air rises, that induces a flow, and that creates turbulence. In this pi chamber, it can also control humidity and aerosols. We didn't use that as much in our experimentation, but it's worth noting that those things were being controlled and measured while we were running the thermistor array. So here's just a diagram of what the pi chamber looks like. On the left is a bird's eye view, and on the right is if you were to slice it in half, how it would look. As you can see here, there's a large circulation running through the entire thing. So it's not just lots of little eddies rising from the top and then coming down from the bottom. There's a large scale circulation which runs through the entire chamber. And if you were to look at it from the top, you could see it going from one corner to the other. This is just a more scientific diagram of what the pi chamber looks like. You probably can't read it very well, but the important part is this shows where all of the instrumentations are, mostly RTDs and sonic anemometer. And as you can see, they're along the edges of the wall. And the reason for that is for this large scale circulation. The RTDs, we were able to make measurements from it, and from the data gathered, we were able to measure where the large scale circulation was coming up from one side and then down on the other side. And then we were able to put the thermistor array in the area where it was coming down. And that's how you're going to get the cleanest turbulent data, because it's just coming straight down onto the thermistor array. And you're not going to get any messy data from it coming, you know, kind of down or kind of up or kind of from the side. It's coming straight down, and you're going to get really clean eddy turbulent data was the hope. And so here's a picture of what that thermistor array looks like. Like I said, we were put it next to the wall right where the large scale circulation was coming down. As you can see here, we tried to point the thermistors so that they would get the direct hit of the turbulence, and then all of the instrumentation was below it so that we could get the cleanest turbulence possible. So all of the wires and everything hung below where the thermistor array was set up. This is a diagram of the thermistor array. So if you can imagine, all of these little blue circles represents a thermistor. This is kind of a bird's eye looking down view of it. And then we spaced them apart. So there were 2 bars of thermistors on it, and the space between those thermistors was a delta Y. And because of the way the array was set up, we weren't able to fluctuate at that at all. However, in the other direction was delta X, and we were able to move those thermistors closer and further apart from each other. And by doing that, that kind of represents a change in the grid spacing. All right, and so like I told you guys, we did the filter to represent the grid space. And so because of that, if we moved the thermistors further away or closer together, that represents different grid spacing of the model. So here's another picture of the thermistor array. Like I said, there was 2 bars with thermistors. So if you can imagine, the distance between these thermistors pointing towards each other is the delta Y right here. And then if you can imagine, the distance between the thermistors that are stacked right next to each other is the delta X, and that's what we were able to vary. So it's shown a little bit clearer here. We're able to vary the delta X. The delta Y stay constant at about 6 centimeters, but the delta X we are able to take several measurements of. We are also able to vary the change in temperature. It always stayed at an average of 20 degrees Celsius, but because we are inducing turbulence by heating the floor and cooling the ceiling, in some of the experiments, we heated the floor much warmer than the ceiling, up to a difference in 20 degrees Celsius. And that was able to induce a very high Reynolds number turbulence, because there's a large difference between the 2 temperatures. And so it got things kind of bouncing around a lot more chaotic. Or we were also able to step through and induce lower and lower Reynolds numbers turbulence all the way until the ceiling and the floor only had about 5 degrees Celsius. And even though that wasn't perfectly laminar, it was obviously much more laminar than the higher temperature difference. And so with those 2 changes, we're able to, in a controlled environment, collect data for various Reynolds number and various gridded spacing. So I explained to you earlier about how the filter is necessary to better understand the grid spacing. This is kind of what that looks like. So we take 3 of the thermistors and we average them together and make one data point. And then we do that with all of the thermistors. And with that, we're able to make this filtered data array, which is what we're then able to build tau with. Even though we haven't quite finished all of the modeling that we hope to do, we have built the one of the taus that I showed you earlier, the first tau. And this is just kind of a brief look at what it looks like. So on the left is the raw data, and then overlaid on top of it is the filtered data. So this is the larger eddies that we would be simulating. And you can see that they're pretty close, but you can see where it spikes up really high or really low. The orange kind of falls short of where the green is because it's not taking into account all of those smaller eddies. On the right is the tau, which is what you would add to the orange to take into account for the smaller eddies. It is in units of temperature squared. And so regardless of whether the raw data is above or below the filtered data, tau will still be positive. But you can still see by looking at it how tau sort of compensates for the difference between the filtered data and the raw data. Like at this 100 point, the raw data deviates significantly from the filtered data, and you can see tau spikes up pretty high, as opposed to like the 300 point where the raw data and the filtered data are pretty close together and tau stays pretty low. So this is a good visualization of how tau compensates for the data that we use by just simulating the larger eddies. So like I said, we haven't finished calculating the models yet, but hopefully we'll be finishing up that this coming semester. And given the different data we are able to get, both with the difference in spacing and with the difference in temperature, we'll be able to explore the sensitivity to filter width and Reynolds number. And a huge thank you to Michigan Tech for letting us come up there and crash their lab and use their Pi chamber to gather data. Any questions?
Go ahead and open questions to the chat. While I do so, are there any questions in the room? What filter widths are you thinking of doing going forward?
So we're using different filter widths depending on the spacing. So those are the different spacings we're using. But for this experiment, we're using like relatively small filter width because it's just like a couple centimeters. Okay, so is that it?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.